What is Fantasy for? This question is something we have to ask ourselves whenever we engage with something of the fantastical type. Similar to how we must engage with writing styles like flow of consciousness and imaginative realism, we must really focus on what the purpose of the form is. To do this, it's worth looking at where certain genres and styles come from. The fantasy genre is a very complex thing, but its origins are still understandable, if a little liquid. From Come Unto These Yellow Sands to Le Morte d'Arthur, fantasy evolved from loose word-of-mouth stories that we might today call fairy tales. These stories flow from place to place, and each has its own distinct symbols and ideas. Irish and Arabian fairy tales, though not as popular as German ones thanks to the efforts of the Grimm brothers, do influence the modern view of fantasy and how it is written today. And one thing that I find very important to realize when discussing the writing of dark fantasy in particular is how it collects and amalgamates both Eastern and Western ideas into a single story. It's very evident in the craft of his masterpiece, Berserk, that regardless of who you are or how much fantasy you have read, chances are that Kentaro Miura has read more. Because of this, Miura understood what fantasy was for, and that understanding is an immense part of what makes Berserk one of the most influential works of fiction ever published. Berserk is a sad story. Saying that it birthed the genre of dark fantasy might be a little hyperbolic, but its influence on what dark fantasy is today is unrivaled. What Tolkien did for modern fantasy, Berserk did for its Stygian counterpart. Guts' life started terribly. He was born out of the corpse of his already deceased mother. Found by a band of mercenaries, his lifelong relationship with war was started. One of the leaders of the band, a man called Gambino, is the only father figure Guts has, and Gambino is not the best of dads. He forces him through rigorous training, gives him only a large man's sword to defend himself with, and physically abuses him despite his young age. But despite this, he is all Guts has. By the time he is a young adolescent, Gambino has grown older and more feeble, even losing a limb in battle. Hatred and bitterness start to brew in the elderly man, and with this hatred comes the second horror of Guts' life, Gambino's betrayal. One night, when Child Guts is trying to sleep in camp, in the dark, a tall man comes into the room and starts tugging at Guts' clothes. Guts tries to fight back and even injures the man, but it's no use. He is too small, and the man's vicious intentions are followed through. He keeps it a secret, until one day he talks to Gambino while he sits in his chair, crippled and powerless. With an evil smile, Gambino admits that he knew what happened to Guts, because the man paid Gambino for the chance to do it. This betrayal is a horrific revelation. Guts, who had nothing but Gambino for protection, now realizes that he had less than nothing all along. The man who he thought held some strange, warped kind of affection for him was the maker of his torture. And this incident, this sexual abuse, is the wretched catalyst for our understanding of what Berserk is about. But first, we need to talk about swords. Swords are powerful things in fantasy, whether it's the mythic Excalibur from Le Morte d'Arthur, or Glamdring, the foe hammer from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Swords can mean a lot of things. Excalibur is a symbol of a chosen hero. It's a manifestation of God's will, a tangible indication of who deserves to be king. And how powerful of an idea that is. Imagine if something like that actually existed. Imagine seeing, with your own eyes, confirmation that your king was the chosen one, that your king had to be good because Excalibur lay at his side. Glamdring, like all of its elvish sisters, glows with a cold white light when orcs are nearby. This is due to the immense power of color in Lord of the Rings, wherein white symbolizes not only a kind of authority, but a protection, usually alluding to the foresight of the ancient collaboration between the elves and the wizards of the years before. The sword itself becomes a symbol for how history can warn us of coming danger, and how only a collaboration of the good forces of Middle-earth can banish the coming dark. This is why, when Gandalf becomes head of the Wizards of Middle-earth, he is renamed Gandalf the White. It is also why Galadriel, an elf, formed the White Council to protect Middle-earth from Sauron's return. The point is that for a couple centuries at least, swords have become very powerful conduits of meaning in literature. And remember, Miura has probably read more literature than you have. Swords in books, at least since the English literary revolution of the late 1500s and early 1600s, have stood for one thing in particular: masculinity. It makes sense on a surface level, right? War was fought with weapons, guns, and swords, but the sword in particular has increasingly gained phallic symbology throughout the years. Literally, the form of the sword has taken on a mantle of phallic meaning. A sword is a long, hard thing, used to penetrate foes, used to dominate others. This symbol's inception is not easy to track, but a good guess is that it originated with Shakespeare. Both sword fights and double entendres are frequent in his plays, often leading to a mixing of the two. The sword fight between Mercutio and Tybalt is especially representative here.
I pray thee, good Mercutio, let's retire.
The
The day is hot. The Capulets abroad. If we meet, we shall not escape a brawl. For now these hot days is the mad blood stirring. Mercutio, let's retire.
Blah, 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 blah. Thou art like one of these fellows that when he enters the confines of a tavern, claps me his sword on the table and says, God send me no need of thee,
Am I
blah,
like-
blah, blah, blah. And by the operation of the second cup, draws him on the drawer when indeed there is no need.
Am I like such a fellow?
Nay, and there were two such, we should have none shortly, for the one would kill the other. Ha! Why, thou hast quarrelled with a man for coughing in the street, because he hath wakened thy dog that lain asleep in the
Mercutio, I
sun.
have-
Ha! Blah, blah, blah! And thou wilt tutor me from quarrelling? Ha!
Mercutio. By my head, here come the Capulets.
Gentlemen, good day.
Good day.
A word with one of you.
And but one word with one us. Couple it with something, make it a word and a blow.
You shall find me apt enough for that, sir, and you will give me occasion.
Can you not take some occasion without the giving?
Mercutio, I've been sorts with Romeo.
Sort? What dost thou make us, minstrels? You make minstrels of us, you look to hear nothing but discords. Here's my fiddlestick. Here's that shall make you dance. Zounds, consort!
We talk here in the public haunt of men. Either withdraw unto some private place, or reason coldly of your grievances, or else depart. Here all eyes gaze on us.
Men's eyes are made to look and let them gaze. I will not budge for no man's pleasure, I.
Well, peace be with you, sir. Here comes my man.
It's hard to read these lines without getting the thin, or thick, hints of homoeroticism that Shakespeare sprinkles throughout these scenes, and Mercutio's sword is the catalyst for this play on words in this scene. In fact, right up to the last moments of the play, when Juliet sees Romeo dead, she pulls his dagger from his belt and says, "This." These symbols, of course, repeat. Similar feelings are felt in works like The Princess Bride, Far from the Madding Crowd, and of course, Berserk. Whether you believe these fights are meant to represent a homoerotic relationship between Guts and Griffith doesn't really matter. What it truly shows is that the feelings these two have for each other swirl into a large mess of emotions. Both masculine forms seek to penetrate, to domineer the other. It's why it's so astonishing to Griffith that Guts would bite his sword during their first fight. Guts' masculine elements won in that moment, and Griffith was impressed, despite still winning the fight in the end. Of course, by standing on Guts' sword. Their second fight is much more solid. Guts and Griffith fight one last time while the cold snow swirls around them, and in the end, Guts releases himself from the Hawk's ownership. This time, he dominates Griffith. For his entire life, Guts' abnormally large sword has stayed at his side, and it has defined how he is looked at by other people. It is undeniably a symbol of his masculinity, of what it means to be a man larger than men, of what it meant to be forced into manhood too soon. I already mentioned the sword Guts receives from Gambino. It is a man's sword, and he is but a child, meaning he trains with the sword as long as he is tall. As the story progresses, Guts' sword grows with him, and the proportions stay the same. This is not on accident. In Berserk, Guts' sword acts as a symbol for himself. When he is powerful and able, it acts accordingly, proving to be the most vicious and efficient blade on the battlefield, easily performing his signature cleave through a horse and its rider in one swing. When he is hurt, however, it becomes a damaged thing too. The symbolism can be contrasted with Griffith's sword, as he has been defined by it as well. Griffith's sword is slender and ornate. It looks stunningly impressive and imperial. In this moment, when Guts and Griffith fight for ownership over Guts' future in the snow, the wrought iron man and the shining falcon bear their manhood against each other. As we know, Guts wins, and he leaves the band of the Hawk. This fight, with all its tension, all its history, and all of its phallic symbolism, colors forever how we view the relationship between Guts and Griffith. That is, until the eclipse. But before we get to that endpoint, we need to talk about one more thing. If swords are phallic symbols that represent the flow of masculine power between these two men, then what do wounds symbolize? And now, we come to Casca. Nudity in Berserk is a carefully constructed thing, even if it might not appear so on first readings. One would be forgiven for being frustrated with Mira's depiction of the female form. Casca, especially, is seen naked throughout the story, but once this depiction is dived into, it becomes much more understandable. Guts, especially early on, is very uncomfortable with nudity. His first time seeing Casca is very uncomfortable for him, and he falls silent. He regularly clothes himself entirely in armor, often leaving his thick greaves on even out of battle. The second time he sees Casca naked is when she is knocked unconscious by falling with him into a river. The two are isolated from their group and hunted by a rival army. Guts realizes that Casca will surely die if she is not warmed up, and undresses her in frustration, giving her his oversized shirt while she recovers. This is something he is forced into, and it goes a long way in helping Guts get used to nudity in general. When Casca wakes up, she is angry, but not at being naked. She is angry because she wasn't able to save herself, due to her being a woman. During this moment, not only is Guts' aversion to nudity melted away, but it is the first time he sees Casca as a woman. The opposite of the term phallic is the word yonic, and Berserk has both of these symbols in one character. Not only is Casca a woman, a human of yonic form, but she is also a mercenary. She too has a sword, and her ability to act as both with Guts is what finally breaks the impenetrable defense he has built around his trauma. And when they sleep together for the first time, something he has hidden away crawls out. This beast is the first representation of Guts' trauma that we have seen in the story at this point. But even this is tempered by Casca too. That night, in the cave, while the rain poured outside and the hunters searched for the pair, Casca told Guts about the time she was assaulted as well. This allows her to understand what is happening with Guts and the beast, and even though the traumatic flashback almost kills Casca, she soothes him. She calms the beast. She was hurt like that too, and she knows what that pain can do. Her story does have one difference though. Right at the last moment, just before she is violated in her childhood, she is rescued by a knight in gleaming white armor. Griffith, the White Hawk. So, Griffith. During the eclipse, Griffith needs to do one thing. He must sacrifice everything he owns. He must give all that he has, all of the Band of the Hawk, all of his friends and companions, all of their futures, to the God Hand. And, with one word, he does. In an instant, all of Griffith's allies, all that he has built up, is given over to the hellish fire. The men are slaughtered and eaten, the brands burn out from their skin, the God Hand watch in wicked delight at the screams of the massacre. But even then, there is one man Griffith does not own. The demons of hell crawl from fleshy floors and hold Guts back. His armor is ripped off, his sword is shattered, and yet he still fights forward. Casca is stripped of her armor and clothes, and wrapped in demonic coils. Griffith, now Femto, part of the God Hand, stares out from a black carapace, pure hatred for Guts in his eyes. But he has what he needs. Guts, before, was entirely clad in phallic power. His huge, unbreakable sword stood between Griffith and him, and blocked any form of ownership. Before now, Guts had no wounds to penetrate. He was devoid of yonic symbols, because of the walls he built up. But now, under the horrid darkness of the eclipse, Guts does have a wound. Because of his love for Casca, because of the walls she brought down in order to show him the affection he never really had, she became an opening. A yonic symbol so powerful, so solid in Guts' life, that Griffith could grip it in his demoniac hands and penetrate it. Guts screams, ripping at the hands of the apostles holding him back. They claw and rend his unprotected skin, tearing off chunks. He plunges the hilt of his shattered sword into the undulating arms and fights toward Casca, toward Griffith. But he is just a man now. Chasmic maws chomp down on him. Impossibly long arms grip his body and press him to the ground. The vicious teeth of a demon close over his arm and hold it tight. He struggles. He sees Casca in front of him, and Griffith looms above. As his hands caress her, it is too much. Guts breaks. He screams even louder and pulls hard at his trapped arm. Skin and sinew tear and shred through the gritted teeth, but still the demon holds. Deaf with rage and fear, Guts stops stabbing the flesh around him and plunges the hilt into his own arm, severing it into a ribbon of bleeding skin and bone. He runs again, but only makes it a few more feet before the bodies of the apostles pile on him again. One long claw reaches forward and pries his face up, forcing him to look at what is about to happen. What follows is one of, if not the most horrific thing in fiction. What would already be almost unbearable to read in a book is rent in the vivid and unforgiving detail of Miura's art. Everything is shown: blood, gore, bodily fluids, and torturous pain, and the wicked eyes of Griffith staring out in cold inhumanity at Guts the entire time. And at the peak of it all, in a haze of delirious pain and trauma, Casca mutters the last words she will speak for hundreds of pages. Don't look. These words collapse it all, on both Guts and us. Casca knows what trauma can do to people. She knows what it has done to Guts in the past, and she knows what it is now going to do to her. But in the middle of it all, in the center of this unthinkably horrid moment, she can still think of Guts. She wants him to look away because she doesn't want it to happen to him again. I struggle to name a piece of fiction that has affected me and my friends more than Berserk. And that fact helps us understand that the reason it is so powerful is because Miura truly does understand what fantasy is for. Fantasy allows us to wrestle with things we cannot see. All of these symbols, these echoing effects of trauma, these elements of acceptance and domination, are things that we frequently experience in real life. Often we are forced to deal with them before we are ready, and the effects can last decades or even lifetimes. But if we can somehow put it onto a page, if we can materialize it into a thing, then we can share it. We can grip onto these intangible tortures, these ideas that force themselves into our lives, and we can visualize ways to heal. Fantasy, with all of its history and beauty, gives our minds something to hold on to, something to mold and turn over and look at. It gives us something to point to and say, I have felt that. Have you too? I have held that sword. I have seen that beast. Excalibur, Glamdring, Dragonslayer, we all carry our own swords with us. What does yours look like? What molten metals were warped and hammered together years ago to make it? During the horrors of the eclipse, Guts' sword is destroyed, symbolizing the unthinkably traumatic impact of that event. Afterward, he is rescued by Rickert, who takes him to a man named Godo, a blacksmith, and the first friend Guts will meet after the eclipse. Rickert, out one night, sees something lying in the corner of the blacksmith's shed, and approaching it, this looms out of the darkness. It was too big to be called a sword. Massive, thick, heavy, and far too rough. Indeed, it was a heap of raw iron. Then, one night, a wandering apostle attacks the group. It smashes towards Godo's house, and Guts goes out to stop it, one-armed and bandaged. He is instead flung into the wreckage of the shed, but soon emerges, holding his new sword, the Dragon Slayer. This challenge, this defiance against the curse set upon him and the now shattered Casca, revives that symbol again. Once more, Guts can hold something that symbolizes his masculine form, and points it at the disciple of Griffith's crime. The apostle is slain, and the sword once said to be far too large for any man to carry, now has a new owner. Casca's mind is shattered by her violation, and she becomes scared of Guts. This becomes too much for him, and he decides to leave her under Godo and Rickert's protection. Still cursed to be hunted by the shadows of Griffith's will, he heads out and becomes the Black Swordsman. But there is one more thing left to understand. Berserk is not a horror story. Its lessons are far too complex and hopeful for it to fall into that category. In the end, though its themes and unrelenting depictions of the horror we can inflict on each other are sometimes very difficult to deal with, there is a ray of hope in Miura's masterpiece. This shining light comes in and out of focus throughout the story, and it is an important part in understanding what it is that Berserk is trying to teach us. That specific analysis is for part 2, but for now, I have one more piece of the story we can focus on. Guts returns to Godo after 2 years of travel. He has seen much, but is doing poorly. His cloak is tattered, his body is covered in partially healed wounds, and he hasn't slept in what looks like weeks. On top of that, Casca has run away, and the guilt weighs on him too. Alone, he fought back the dark forces that relentlessly pursued him. He can no longer calm his nerves without his sword nearby, and it shows. The blade is notched and blunted. Its edge has been worn down by the armor and bones of his enemies, and it is but a shell of what it was before. In only 2 years, the sword is reduced to a hulking rod of iron, more like a club than a blade. Godo sees this, and has a talk with Guts. The sword is in need of repair, and so is he. Despite a sickness, Godo forges the blade anew, with Rickert's help. A good sword, even if it rusts and dulls, has good steel that never rusts left over in the wick, that steels the ultimate steel, even if it cracks. If you return it to the fire, it's sure to be reborn. Tell this to that fool. Don't turn out like me. Just like a sword, we too have a human steel, a perfect iron at our center that never rusts or dulls, even if we are cracked, even if we are penetrated to our very core. But we need others to bring out that iron again. Alone we can build up our walls, we can heft the impossible burdens of the horrors of life. But we all need to sit around a warm fire and be smelted anew by our loved ones, our teachers, our friends. And being able to understand what that looks like. That is what fantasy is for.